The sea was calm but uneasily so, a silence that always came just before something terrible. Aboard the USS Ranshaw, a 22-year-old sailor named Eli Turner leaned against the starboard railing, eyes scanning the dark water like he'd done 100 times before. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, not from fear but anticipation. They were patrolling just south of Guadalcanal. It was supposed to be routine. 42 p.m. A sudden blast ripped the ocean open from below. Boom, steel screamed. Fire shot skyward. The deck lurched violently beneath Eli's feet. He slammed into the rail, the cigarette vanishing into the night. Torpedo hit. Aft side. Men scrambled. Flames swallowed the rear third of the ship. Oil tanks ruptured, their black blood seeping everywhere, sparking hell the moment fire kissed it. Sailors screamed underwater and above it. Some never surfaced. Eli crawled across the deck, disoriented. A friend passed him, face bloodied, mouth open, no sound coming out, just the shock of collision. And there, through the smoke, a silhouette vanishing across the waves. A Japanese submarine. Silent. Untouched. Gone. In 5 minutes, the Ranshaw was crippled. 54 dead. Dozens more scorched and traumatized. One torpedo had done all of it. And in a locked storage building halfway across the Pacific, in crates marked "Classified Inactive Test Material," sat a weapon. Not a fantasy. Not a half-finished prototype. A fully functional anti-submarine device capable of tracking targets twice as fast and detonating on sound. A design 16 times more effective than standard U.S. depth charges. It had already passed testing. It had already proven its lethality, but it was marked as non-standard. It didn't look like what the others used. It didn't come from the same approved manufacturers. It wasn't routine, so it stayed shelved. They had weapons, but not the best ones. The one that could have stopped this was sitting in a box. Refused. This isn't just a story about what we used in war. It's about what we didn't. He had the look of someone who belonged more in a university lab than a war room. Dr. Everett Walsh, 36 years old, soft-spoken, almost too quiet for the rooms he was forced to present in. But his mind was volcanic. In the basement of that government complex, surrounded by wires, charts, and models, Dr. Walsh had built something unlike anything the Navy had ever approved. An acoustic homing torpedo, capable of detecting engine noise, adjusting its path in real time, and tracking enemy submarines like a bloodhound beneath the sea. While traditional torpedoes relied on guesswork and grid coordinates, Walsh's weapon could hear, could think, could kill. It was faster, deadlier, smarter, and in simulated trials, harsh water tanks, staged submarine evasions, hard data. The numbers were unbelievable. A 900% increase in interception and destruction rates over the Navy's primary torpedo, the unreliable Mark 14. His design hit nearly every target. Times quicker, 16 times more precise, more death to the enemy. He called it the Manta, sleek, silent, lethal. The tests were done. The results were in. But when he presented the findings to the Bureau of Ordnance, the response was a wall of indifference. Unproven, unconventional, unreliable, said Vice Admiral Clemmings without even looking up from his folder. Too different from the Mark system. Our men are trained on the 14. No budget to transition mid-war, another officer mumbled. Let's not forget, someone added, that this comes from a civilian. That word hung in the air like an accusation. Civilian. Not Navy, not one of us. Everett didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there, knowing what they didn't yet know. Ships would burn. Men would drown. Hundreds, maybe thousands, would pay the price for their comfort with the familiar. As the board moved on to discussing supply chain issues and toilet seat manufacturers, Everett packed up his blueprints. No one asked for a copy. Outside wind whipped across the Potomac. Walsh stood in the cold, staring at the water. A river, calm for now. But war would soon come, fast and brutal. And when it did, it would be fought with tools that had already failed. Back in the lab, the Manta torpedo was layered in canvas and quietly shelved, marked non-standard, experimental prototype. A file was stamped, inactive, a weapon that could have turned the Pacific into a graveyard for enemy submarines, buried by red tape because it wasn't built by the right people, or approved on the right forms, because it didn't follow the rules. In a few short months, reports would pour in. American depth charges missing their targets. Convoys gutted. Destroyers dragged beneath the sea, screaming for an answer that had existed the whole time. But in this moment, no alarms sounded. Just one man, and a machine forgotten by the institution that was supposed to win the war. No gunfire, no steel, no smoke, just silence, interrupted only by the shuffle of papers and the occasional muttered objection about budgets, logistical risk, and standard operating procedure. This was another battlefield. No ships would sink here. Not today. But decisions made around this table would echo across oceans in detonations, in lost convoys, in shattered hulls. The Navy's weapon approval system in the early years of World War II was a maze of bureaucracy, politics, and pride. On paper, it was designed to ensure quality, safety, and strategic alignment, but in practice, it often rewarded familiarity over function, contracts over creativity, and seniority over science. Every new weapon idea, no matter how promising, faced a ceremonial gauntlet, technical demonstration, often disregarded with a shrug, evaluation by admiralty boards, many of whom hadn't seen combat in years, comparative analysis against weapons already in production, usually judged unfairly, and worst of all, contractor loyalty. If your innovation didn't come from an established military supplier, General Electric, Westinghouse, Sperry Corporation, its chances were already crippled. The contracts were multi-million-dollar playgrounds, roped off with thick velvet lines. An engineer at a desk may have created a war-winning breakthrough, but if it threatened even one strand in the tangled web of procurement policy, it was dismissed with a smile and a signature. Most generals weren't malicious. They were cautious and scared. Scared of being the one who backed a weapon that failed in frontline service. Scared of taking the blame history never forgets. Innovation looked dangerous when held beside routine. Too unconventional, muttered one procurement officer. About the Manta torpedo, our current contracts are working fine, said another. Don't fix what's not broken, they echoed, even as armed merchant ships floated broken on the sea floor. War had come suddenly. America, despite its vast industrial might, wasn't ready. Doctrine was still rooted in 1918 submarine detection. Primitive torpedo guidance, embarrassingly outdated. Frontline commanders were sending back reports. Our depth charges detonated too late. Target escaped by changing course. Visual confirmation of hits, 0. But these never reached the conference room. What did reach were purchase orders, timelines, supply chains, and the question, will the current vendor object to having their design pulled? The Navy had its chosen tools, the Mark 14 torpedo, the Mk6 exploder, the Y-gun depth projector. They worked well enough in theory, most of the time, and were backed by deep-rooted relationships. Challenges to that status quo were quietly buried under terms like out of specification, non-compliant, operationally incompatible. These weren't critiques of the weapon. They were code for "not ours." Metaphors need few words. "But they speak volumes. War isn't just won with guns," said one frustrated veteran engineer. "It's lost in offices, by men who never bled, stamping papers they never had to pay for." The real villain wasn't incompetence, it was inflexibility, a system built not to win fast, but to never fail publicly. And that system, that fortress of clipped speech and salty coffee, wore a Navy badge and operated under the illusion that it was keeping the war machine running. In reality, it was silently starving it. Outside the Pentagon, inventors waited. Designers, hungry to help, held prototypes that could have changed the battlefield overnight. But behind the doors, change was dangerous. And in war, sometimes dangerous is what saves you. Ships burned, pilots died, convoys disappeared. Not only because the enemy struck hard, but because someone, somewhere, had once said, "Let's keep using the one we know, even if it doesn't work." December 1942. The SS Harrison was the third ship that week to vanish in the black fog off Greenland. An American Liberty ship, 5,000 tons of ammunition, rations, and fuel, all gone in a single blast beneath the keel before the crew even saw a periscope. Only 8 men survived. The rest either went down with the ship or froze in lifeboats that never touched land. Not one destroyer escort detected the sub that killed them. It was standard now, a grim routine. Convoys departed, U-boats waited. The escorts tried to stop them with Mark 14 depth charges. Crude, slow reacting, and manually timed. Most detonated yards behind enemy contact. Some didn't detonate at all. And every time a captain asked for better tools, he got assurances instead. There was no shortage of bravery, just a shortage of belief in something different. 100 miles away, in a test tank near Norfolk, Virginia, a lab technician named Murray Clark stood before a chalkboard, pointing at sonar strike patterns. He looked more like a math professor than a warrior, glasses fogged with breath in the cold lab, sleeves rolled past the wrist. But his data screamed what the sea could no longer whisper. "This isn't theory anymore," he told his superior in November. "The Manta torpedo hits 88% of live underwater targets at 50 knots. The current model hits 12%. You don't even need a full adoption. Just give it to convoy flanks." The response came in a memo. 2 words. "Not approved." Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, Commander Jules McKinnon of the USS Javelin wept quietly behind blown-out comms after losing 3 transports in one night. Each one he had promised to protect. They had been stalked, hunted. He dropped 28 depth charges over 6 hours. None connected. "We got acoustics after the sub was gone," he wrote in a letter. "I had nothing that could listen, nothing that could chase." Then, underlined in grease pencil, "They asked us for more ammo. We gave them red tape." Clark remembered that line. It reached him in an envelope a month later. Folded, singed from a small fire, barely legible under a coffee stain. "McKinnon says he wants anything we've got, even experimental, even paper-clipped together. He doesn't care," Clark told his director. Again, refused. It didn't matter that the lab had live test results. It didn't matter that they had a working prototype. The kill data couldn't beat the contract, and the Manta, capable of triangulating based on submarine engine pitch, able to course-correct mid-dive, deadly at speeds never before weaponized below the surface, sat in rusting crates under tarps. The approval required a command signature that no one wanted to own. They feared headlines more than they feared losing ships, Clark would later say. In the following 16 months, between late 1942 and early 1944, over 700 Allied ships were sunk or damaged by submarine warfare. Thousands of sailors, Engineers, gunners, gone. Each time, after-action reports told the same story. Submerged enemy escaped prior depth deployment. Sonar. Contact lost after initial sighting. Explosives. Deployed outside kill radius. Clark updated his models, tuned the Manta's detection. Range. Refined the shape. Increased its tracking stability. The Navy updated nothing, except body counts. Then came the breaking point. March 1944. A modified Fletcher-class destroyer, on a secret trial off the coast of Montauk, deployed 2 Manta units quietly approved for live combat analysis, both locked onto sonar-masked sub-signatures. 2 kills in under 90 seconds. No ship loss, no damage, and for the first time in 2.5 years, a convoy passed through the most brutal U-boat corridor in the Atlantic, untouched. The field report hit Norfolk, then D.C. Then an emergency procurement request landed on the desk of Admiral Ryland Keel, the same man who'd once called the Torpedo overhyped tin work. His official internal reply? Recommend immediate scaled tier test deployment. Unofficially, he never mentioned he'd sat on the file 12 months. Prior, it was finally approved, but not because the data changed, because the damage had, because the loss could no longer hide under a spreadsheet. Too much time had passed, too many letters, had reached too many widows. And now, as the Manta readied for active deployment, there was a kind of hollow victory among the men who built it. The weapon would fight, but it would never save those who'd bought its delay with their lives. We invented it to stop that kind of night, Clark said in a quiet interview decades later. But the night came anyway, over and over, and while they sank, we waited for a signature. The signature was quiet. A pen, a stroke, an authorization code stamped in black ink. No bugle sounded, no announcement made. But in a sealed envelope marked Accelerated Combat Deployment, the Manta acoustic torpedo was officially designated as active U.S. Navy ordnance, spring, 1944. 2.5 years after it had first proven itself. 800 ships too late. By now, the letters were piling up. Admirals were being forced into closed-door inquiries. Congress had begun to ask difficult questions. Why are Germany's U-boats still punching holes through our convoys? Why haven't you adopted the systems your own engineers proved in 1942? At sea, commanders were improvising with duct tape and desperation. At home, newspapers published the death tolls in tidy columns, row after row of names never coming home. The Navy's confidence had begun to crack under the weight of silence. And finally, the wall gave way. Within 6 weeks, Manta torpedoes were shipping out in batches, under armed escort to strategic Atlantic zones, first, to destroyer squadrons in high-risk U-boat channels, then to fast attack subs for defensive capability. Finally, to convoy commanders with written protocols for acoustic engagement that had never existed before. The impact was immediate. On May 19, 1944, Task Group 24.5, escorting a cluster of supply ships off Iceland, detected 3 submerged signals converging on the 8 o'clock vector. 2 years ago, that would have meant panic. Scatter. Pray for luck. But this time, they deployed Manta units at calculated intervals, preset to track the turbine hum of diesel-powered Type 9 submarines. 3 contacts, 3 detonations. Flames reached the surface. The convoy passed through untouched. It hunted them, said one sonar officer. We didn't guess. We didn't hope. We killed. More reports followed. Task Force 61, patrolling near the Azores, was ambushed by 4 U-boats. Mantas deployed. 2 subs destroyed on approach. The other 2 retreated without even launching. For the first time, U-boats were hunted before they hunted. They were being denied their stock, denied their favorite weapon, fear. Enemy communication logs intercepted weeks later revealed growing alarm. The Americans have a new device, read a decrypted message from a German naval commander. It hears us before we align. Their depth charges aren't missing anymore. Recommend new evasion protocols or avoid contact entirely. In D.C., Rear Admiral Charles Benning held a folded telegram in his lap, hands trembling as he read, "Thanks to your team, we brought them all home. All 9 ships. No losses, no dead boys." His jaw tightened. 2 years ago, that same route had claimed 16 vessels. One of them held his brother. He never replied to the telegram. What would he say? Thank you. Too late?
I'm sorry?
Some victories come too late to celebrate. Fleet survival rates rose by 37% in 3 months. Manta kill efficiency climbed with every update. Now with dual pitch range filters to distinguish between German and Allied vessels. Training manuals were reprinted, doctrine rewritten, and still, the men who had first built it watched every success with hollow hearts. Murray Clark, the engineer who had overseen the first acoustic tracking prototype back in '41, stood quietly at the edge of a pier in Norfolk as a refitted destroyer hauled away several torpedo racks marked Manta System Unit 2B. A young technician beside him chuckled, holding a wrench on his belt. "If we had this last year," he said, "my uncle might still be alive." They loved those convoys. He said they always felt like guardians. Clark didn't say anything at first. Then, quietly, "Too late for the men who sank in 1942, but not too late for you. Victory doesn't erase delay. It doesn't wash away indecision or bring back those who slipped beneath the ice in the dark. But when the shadows break, and the right weapon finally unlocks the right chance, even regret can carry a purpose. Even guilt can become fuel." So they used it, quietly, ruthlessly. And for every sub that exploded in deep water, for every crew that made it home, a silent name lived in the silence beneath. The men who died without it. The men who proved why it mattered. Dr. Everett Walsh never wore a uniform. He never fired a shot. Most American war heroes were etched into memory with medals and missions. Walsh's war was quieter, one with chalk, wire, silence, and obsession. But he carried more ghosts than most soldiers ever had to. He said little in public, but when they finally called him to speak before the Wartime Commission, decades after the Manta system had become Navy standard, he stood straight, eyes locked ahead. No script, just a folded letter in his right hand and a voice full of battles no one else had seen. "If you'd heard their screams," he began, "you wouldn't have called it unproven." The room fell still. They were all officers now, decorated, gray-templed, comforted by success. But in that moment, none of them could meet his eyes. Back in 1941, before the first boats had burned, before the first convoys had vanished without a trace, Walsh was just a name buried in the footnotes of naval engineering. He wasn't flashy. He didn't carry credentials from Annapolis. What he carried were ideas, one of them in particular. The Manta. It wasn't a bigger bomb. It was a smarter hunter, a torpedo that could seek out the sound of enemy subs, track moving targets in real time by pitch and propeller rhythm. The first acoustic-guided warhead of its kind. It was 15 years ahead of its time, and that was the problem. They laughed in the boardroom, called it science fiction. Too sensitive, too precise, too expensive. Let the destroyers drop depth charges. "It's what they're trained for," said one admiral. "This is a war," another muttered. "Not a physics experiment." Walsh took the dismissal quietly. He wasn't a fighter. He was a builder. So he went back to his lab. He recalibrated, rebuilt, retested, reformulated. He sent in new results with improved guidance accuracy and a field report showing enemy kill simulation rates hitting over 84%. Nothing changed. Then the letters, started coming in. From sea. Destroyer commanders, who had lost 4 ships in a single week. Escort captains begging for something, anything, that could target prowling U-boats before they struck. In silence, Walsh read them all, highlighted them, filed them, and kept writing updates no one read. Then, in spring of 1942, the USS Hestrom was sunk with all hands near the North Atlantic. On board was Commander Robert Langford, Walsh's closest friend. They had shared coffee-stained blueprints in peacetime, argued over fuel compression ratios, laughed about getting old in an ocean no longer meant for them. Langford's body was never recovered. When Walsh heard the news, he didn't cry. He unplugged the lab lights and worked for 36 hours. No meals, no calls, no more pleading letters. He knew then. They'd already killed the men he was trying to save. The Manta was approved in 1944, after Rear Admiralty was cornered in a hearing they couldn't talk their way out of. Walsh wasn't even in the room. The results were immediate. Convoys that once lost 3 ships now lost none. Enemy kill rates doubled, then tripled. But Walsh didn't celebrate, because he knew how many had died buying time for someone else's courage to catch up. One autumn afternoon, not long after deployment began, Walsh visited a naval repair dock in San Diego. A Fletcher-class destroyer had returned from convoy duty loaded with blast scars, but still afloat. As the crew disembarked, a sailor in his 20s stepped down and stopped when he recognized Walsh from a briefing photo he'd once seen. "You're the doc, right?" he asked. Walsh nodded. "The Manta guy?" Another nod. The sailor's eyes reddened. He reached into his jacket and handed over a grimed, folded picture. 2 boys, grinning side by side in uniform. "Brothers?" "This thing saved me," the sailor said, choking. "We got hit only once." And the torpedo fired back before they finished the second shot. He pushed the photo toward Walsh. "But my brother was gone before they ever approved it," he whispered. "Sank in 42. They never found him. We were on the same carrier list. He went down 2 years before I got this tech." Walsh reached out and touched the photo gently. "You saved me," the sailor said again. "But not him." Walsh closed his eyes. "We could have saved them too," he said. There were no more words after that. He declined awards, turned down write-ups. When a Navy documentary asked to feature him, he refused. Said the real work was done by the men who paid the price of delay. But he kept every letter. From sailors, from widows, from officers who once told him his invention was too strange to be trusted. Some praised him. Some digested the guilt. He read every single one. He placed them all in a wooden box, up on the shelf in his office, labeled only with one word: Echoes. Years later, his hair gone silver and his hands thinner than shell casings, he walked slowly into the Naval Museum where the original prototype of his invention sat behind glass. No one recognized him. Families wandered by placards and maps. Kids pressed buttons on interactive screens. Over near the far end, the sleek casing of a Manta sat untouched in its display case, captioned only by a small plaque. First deployed, 1944. Walsh stood in front of it, one hand resting softly against the glass. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence remembered for him. They had called him impractical, emotional, naive. But the Manta had worked, just not soon enough, because sometimes the truth takes longer than it should, and even when it comes, it still has a cost. In war, truth doesn't always come from inside your own borders. Sometimes the truth is whispered in enemy code, and sometimes your vindication is buried deep inside your enemy's fear. By mid-1944, American naval victories were on the rise. U-boat ambushes were thinning out. Japanese submarine activity was growing more erratic. Convoys, once shredded by hidden wolves, were now arriving intact. Too many. too often to be coincidence. But it wasn't just American commanders who noticed. Enemy commanders were watching, too. Inside a naval intelligence listening post near Pearl Harbor, a cryptographer intercepted a Japanese transmission en route to several Pacific subs stationed west of the Marianas. The decoded fragment chilled everyone in the room. Avoid direct approach to enemy convoys between 12 degrees and 21 degrees. Rumors. Confirmed deployment of listening torpedoes. Do not surface within 15 km range unless escape vector is prepared. The date, August 2nd, 1944. It was the first time Japan had acknowledged something the U.S. Navy had barely begun to use, and barely believed in just a year earlier. They called them ghost fish, torpedoes that listened, weapons that anticipated. Back in Germany, similar messages began appearing in intercepted Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine communications. One such report, decrypted weeks after D-Day, came from a U-boat commander who had just lost two of his sister vessels in rapid succession during a convoy raid. New detection net is not optical. Reaction time is unnatural. Targeted before we breach formation. American torpedoes no longer guess. They hunt. He didn't know its name, didn't know what it looked like, but he knew something had changed, and he wasn't alone. By autumn 1944, repeat phrases became common in both Axis Navy chatter and non-cipher field reports. Device hears us before we breach shallow. Metal shark beneath the waves. American countermeasure extrem gefährlich. Sofortige Rückkehr empfohlen. Extremely dangerous. Immediate return advised. Some U-boats were aborting patrols halfway through deployment. Others refused to approach certain convoy zones entirely. For years, Allied commanders had fought the myth of German supremacy. Weapons like the Bismarck, the U-boats, the torpedoes that seemed unfairly advanced. But now, the myth was starting to flip. Now, the enemy believed the U.S. had developed something unstoppable. The irony, the Americans had almost buried it. The weapon they dismissed as a gimmick, the one they approved out of pressure, not faith. The Manta, the torpedo that was too advanced for approval in 1942, was now so effective in 1944, the enemy believed it operated on futuristic detection logic. Intel officers turned all of this over to Naval Strategic Command. The response? A single word scribbled in the margin of the decrypted bundle. Interesting? No fanfare. No speech. Just a quiet recognition. From men who had seen too many friends bury their doubts too late. Eventually, Walsh was shown the intercepts. Someone thought it might give him satisfaction. He read the memos slowly, in silence, letting each phrase land like the echo of a missed opportunity. Then he folded the file and handed it back. I knew it worked, he said. I didn't need the enemy to tell me that. Just needed our own people to believe it. The greatest confirmation hadn't come from combat trials or graphs. It had come from whispers in bunkers 4,000 miles away, from fear in the eyes of submariners who never saw death coming, because it now came first. What American command had once dismissed as a footnote had become a weapon dreaded by those who prided themselves on being the hunters. And when the hunters began to run, the war began to shift. Victory doesn't always end the argument. When World War II ended in 1945, there were parades, confetti, and medals. But behind the speeches and ceremony, deeper questions began to surface. Questions not about battlefield bravery, but about decisions made far from the front. In quiet government rooms and declassified memos, officials began cataloging the war's internal failures, projects that had failed, reports that had been ignored, lives that had been lost, not because of enemy strength, but because of Allied hesitation. And more than once, the name Manta resurfaced. Post-war hearings convened in 1946 under the Armed Services Committee to assess wartime naval innovations. The goal was to evaluate what had worked, and what hadn't been given a chance to work soon enough. The Manta was the crown jewel of both success and controversy. Witness after witness came forward. Young officers who had survived convoy duty because of Manta's acoustic capabilities, engineers who'd worked under Dr. Everett Walsh, even retired admirals who had, once behind closed doors, dismissed the project as a peacetime luxury. The transcripts were brutal. If it had been deployed sooner, one fleet commander testified bluntly, we might still have 6 of the 9 ships we lost in November of '42. Our own bureaucracy, another added, was deadlier than some enemy torpedoes. One internal Navy study estimated that over 900 American sailors' lives could have been saved had Manta or a comparable guidance system been deployed even 18 months earlier. It wasn't conjecture. It was math. The boards handled it clinically, objectively, but the truth was clear. They had won the war, but not as cleanly or as quickly as they could have. And a quiet line began to echo through post-war reports, passed not as a slogan, but as a confession. We won the war, but we didn't have to lose so much to do it. In 1952, a classified Navy assessment titled Delayed Innovations in Naval Warfare ranked Manta as one of the top 3 wartime technologies that had faced avoidable obstructions to deployment. The other 2 were radar-linked fire control and proximity fuses, both initially blocked. Both eventually changed the course of battles, but the Manta's difference lay not just in its power, but in its timing. It had worked the moment it was born, and had simply not been believed. Historians looking back on the delay now connected to a broader pattern of mid-century military conservatism, an unwillingness to deviate from what we know, even when the evidence said otherwise. Documentaries touch it briefly. Museum placards mention it faintly. But the full story? The cost of delay? That mostly lives in footnotes and in the names carved into marble. When Dr. Everett Walsh died in 1968, his obituary was short. No war medals, no glowing tributes, just 5 lines printed beside an ad for a car dealership. But one sentence stood out. He built the weapon that couldn't come fast enough. It didn't need to say more. His silence had always been louder than fanfare. Those who served, those who survived because of what he created, they remembered. A decade later, the Navy offered to name a destroyer-class sonar system in his honor. His family declined. "I don't think that's what he would have wanted," his daughter said in a statement. "He wasn't trying to leave a name behind. He was trying to leave fewer graves behind." Today, the Manta system sits in a rarely visited section of the Naval Undersea Museum in Keyport, Washington. Most guests walk past it, misled by its slender size and unassuming design. Few know what it is. Fewer still know what it prevented, or what it couldn't. And next to it, sealed under glass, is a faded original blueprint, with Walsh's handwriting scrawled in the corner. Engine pulse. 6772 RPM. Approaching lock, listen, track, save. A weapon designed to be unheard. A man who never raised his voice, and a system whose greatest success was never getting used fast enough. Innovation is never clean. It threatens the powerful. It disrupts the comfortable. It breaks procedures and sidesteps protocol. But sometimes it saves lives. The story of the Manta was never just about steel and circuitry. It was about belief. Winning and losing battles not with bullets, but with vision. Because the truth is this: the Navy didn't need better weapons in 1941. It already had one. They just didn't believe in it. Instead, they believed in policy, in hierarchy, in muscle memory. And men died while the data sat locked in a cabinet, covered in red stamps and cautionary notes from men who had never stood on a deck under enemy fire. So let the question linger. What if every great idea had to wait for permission? What if every life-saving breakthrough had to pass through fear before it reached the front? How many more Mantas were shelved before they had a chance? How many wars dragged on because the answer came early, but not loud enough? Change in war, as in life, rarely comes from the top. It comes from someone like Everett Walsh, someone ordinary, quiet, someone who saw what didn't exist yet and was willing to build it. Alone if he had to, and too often, that idea meets its first enemy, not on the battlefield, but in the boardroom. Not in steel, but in ego. Now go back, not in memory, but in image, to the opening scene. The deck, the sea, that narrow moment where a ship was doomed. Only this time something is different. No explosion, no fire. The sailor still leans on the rail. But this time, the sonar pings. The weapon is launched. And somewhere beneath the waves, before the kill shot can ever be fired, it ends. Because someone, somewhere, believed soon enough. In war, fear of change can be deadlier than the enemy, and the most powerful weapon in any arsenal isn't the one with the most explosive force. It's the one that's deployed in time. This isn't just a story about weapons. It's a lesson about vision, about courage, and about the cost of hesitation. A torpedo ignored, a blueprint buried, a war that cost thousands more than it had to, not because the enemy outmatched us, but because someone said, not now, not yet, not the way we've always done it. History isn't always shaped by the battlefield. Sometimes it's shaped by the silence in a boardroom, or a signature that never came. The Manta didn't appear in wartime posters. Everett Walsh's name never made headlines, but they could have altered the course of the air and sea. Sooner, faster, with fewer names carved into white stone. This wasn't a science fiction concept. This happened, a real weapon, a real delay, a real cost. And its story is one of hundreds that sit at the edge of being forgotten. At War II Diaries, we don't tell these stories because they're famous. We tell them because they're missing. From the books, from the screens, from the official versions of history, these are the stories pulled from footnotes, from letters, from after-action reports written by hands that shook as they signed, if you believe. The past deserves to be told with honesty, drama, and heart. Subscribe, share, and help us keep these forgotten stories alive, because some lessons came too late for them, but not for us.